to you, Minister Schweitzer.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Brenda and Tony, for your leadership and pulling this meeting together with everybody on the board. And you know, I think the mayor's gone, but I was just going to say thank you to the mayor for his advocacy on this key project. And I remember before I was elected, you know, there was a little bit of, you know, politics around this project, and I'm just glad that we've been able to take the tone, just kind of advocacy, take the politics out of this issue. It's an important project. All parties now in Alberta support SR1. We've got Minister McIver. You know, he and I were running in the last provincial election campaign, and I really got to say that, excuse me, get a little bit of frog in my throat there. That, you know, when there's some politics going on with this project in that election campaign, I reached out to Rick McIver. He and I were both running at that point in time, and I said, look, we need to make sure, you know, we have a voice for Calgary. And we advocate to get this project built for our community. There's lots of more flood, you know, mitigation that's required, but in my view, SR1 was just, you know, critical for us going forward as a community, as a city, and the infrastructure project just made sense. And I really have to say that the advocacy of having, you know, Rick McIver, and he's just, if you know Rick, he just has a common sense approach. Having him there at the table as a voice in the, you know, the Calgary Candidates Committee, you know, asking for a common sense solution on flood mitigation was critical for us as a party to, you know, take a clear position in support of SR1. And I just have to say that it's a huge thank you to him and his team with the diligence that they've had, you know, working on this file now for 1.5 years. The progress where we are now, we've actually had a pre-hearing. I thought we would never get to the point where we're actually having, you know, that discussion of a hearing dates and getting the stuff scheduled. So it's just encouraging to be at this point. You know, obviously we still have lots of work to do to get it through the hearing process. But you know what, we're dedicated behind this project. I know how important this project is to the community. You know, I remember just talking to, you know, families, kids, people that were impacted in their, you know, an emotional toll on so many people. So I just want to say again, thank you to the advocacy of the group here. I do say that the work that you did helped, you know, help make this a key priority in the last election campaign. So thank you to you for all your advocacy efforts to get that done. And I just want to say thank you for continuing to engage, you know, your advocacy. I do encourage everyone, if you're inclined, to do write those letters of support for the hearing process. And again, just appreciate everyone and all your efforts on this. Again, this is critical. We have to get this done for the community. And again, just thank you to everyone for all your time today and being a part of this important initiative.
All right, thank you very much, Minister Schweitzer. I appreciate you making those comments. I agree with you that it is encouraging to be at this point. It's been a long time coming, at least with respect to the Elbow River. Unfortunately, we're not quite there yet on the Bow River, but we're making progress and moving forward, so that is encouraging. We have several speakers tonight that will be providing us more specific information about the state of the Springbank Off-Stream Reservoir Project, flood mitigation infrastructure for the Bow River, and flood mitigation activities happening within the city limits. So the speakers will be available for a Q&A session at the end of the presentations, which, as we've mentioned, will be facilitated using the Q&A function. I urge you to use the Q&A function rather than the chat. If you use the chat, it's possible your question's going to get lost in the mix. The Q&A function's a little more user-friendly for us. We may not get to all of your questions tonight, but we will endeavor to answer them offline if we aren't able to answer them tonight. So you can enter them at any time, and it would be helpful if you indicate who your question is directed to. If you have a particular speaker in mind, we'll then get to answering these questions later on in the evening. So our first speaker is the Honorable Rick McIver, Minister of Transportation. Alberta Transportation has been tasked with designing and constructing the Springbank Off-Stream Reservoir Project. It is Minister McIver's department that's leading the charge on Springbank, and the minister has been an ardent supporter of flood mitigation for Calgary during his tenure in office, which we're very appreciative of. So at this time, I would like to turn the floor over to the minister. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Brenda, and good evening, Minister Schweitzer. It's great to see you and everybody else here tonight. It's good for me to be here, even if it's only through a screen. We had to make adjustments during these times, and we'll continue to adapt as required. I know the Calgary River Communities Action Group is a strong supporter of the Springbank Offstream Reservoir, or SR1, as it's more commonly called. I'm grateful for the involvement of organizations like yours, because you folks have lived the dream or nightmare, whatever it was, right back from 2013. Like you, the government of Alberta knows all too well what another catastrophic flood like the one that ravaged Calgary and other communities in 2013 could do to people's livelihoods, their properties, and their lives. So I'm pleased to be here to update you on the project. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the calls, emails, and other correspondence my office has received regarding the project. It's been 7 years now since the devastating flood in the summer of 2013. So the 8th spring is the next one coming up, and I know that weighs heavily on me and probably many of you. A flood that caused more than $5 billion in damage and recovery costs. And let me be clear, our focus for flood mitigation along the Elbow River has not wavered. We remain committed to SR1. Budget 2020 included $196.3 million over 3 years for SR1. The current project budget is $432 million, but this will depend, of course, on the final land acquisition costs, final design and tendering, and costs associated with the regulatory process, which we don't control, and impact of the project taking longer to complete than initially anticipated. That said, SR1 is eligible for federal support of $168 million under the Government of Canada's Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. Thank you. And we think it's worthy. We think it's really worthy of that federal funding. Work continues to secure more land for the project, and my department continues its work to move the project through the regulatory process. We must get past 2 reviews, not one. One provincial and one federal are underway. Through each of them, we will show how critical this project is to the lives and livelihoods of Calgarians and Southern Albertans. We'll also show we can mitigate and respond to the project's impacts. The regulators must be duly diligent and must be satisfied the effects from the project are adequately mitigated. As the regulatory process continues, the provincial regulator, the National Natural Resources Conservation Board, or the NRCB, held an oral pre-hearing conference on December 2nd. That pre-hearing conference heard certain preliminary and procedural aspects of the review. And it's also included a discussion of the major issues to be examined at the hearing, the appropriate scope and jurisdiction of the review, and other matters. This is an important step in the regulatory process, and one my department has been preparing for as we gear up for the actual NRCB hearing. At this time, we're waiting for the NRCB to determine next steps, although I think I heard here March 22nd is the date that the hearing happens. In the meantime, my department continues to complete responses to questions raised by Alberta Environment and Parks. As you know, this project also requires approval from the federal regulator, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, or IAAC. The IAAC, they could have picked something easier to say if they went with an acronym, but the IAAC will consider SR1's potential environmental, health, social, and economic impacts and benefits. It also considers First Nations treaty rights and Indigenous peoples' rights. The IAAC is currently reviewing Alberta Transportation's responses to questions raised through the federal regulatory review process. Officials in Alberta Transportation are waiting for confirmation from the IAAC on their next steps in the review of the project. The IAAC reviews all of this information, and then the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Canada, will determine whether the project is likely to cause significant adverse effects. Following this, we expect a decision statement, which would include any relevant conditions that need to be applied to the project. The decision statement from IAAC will also include any relevant conditions to be applied and fulfilled by the project. As you can see, it's a complex process, but it's worth it because we got to protect Southern Alberta, including Calgary. Because once the project receives both provincial and federal approval, it will provide capacity for a 1 in 100 year flood after 2 years of construction. After a 3rd year of construction, SR1 would be capable of preventing the 2013 flood. We're all here tonight because we want to learn from the mistakes of the past, and we hope never see them repeated. SR1 will provide significant flood protection to Calgary and other communities. As well, SR1 is just one of several flood mitigation measures that will be implemented for this area. Government, your government, is committed to this project. As with any project of this nature, stakeholder consultation is imperative. It's part of what we're doing here now. That engagement, which also has been ongoing since 2014, has included public information sessions, group meetings, presentations, one-on-one consultations, phone calls, emails, interviews, and information requests. Staff from my department have attended many meetings with stakeholders. We've also held 12 public open houses in the Springbank area, Calgary, Bragg Creek, and Cochrane, including town halls in Springbank and Bragg Creek this fall. Your group has been at many, if not all of these open houses, and representatives from CRCAG have met with my department regularly for the past several years. I want to thank you for your continued involvement, dedication, and commitment to getting this important project built. This project is key for public safety and for our economy. I know you understand this and are eager to see the project built. Let me assure you that my colleagues across government and I continue to work diligently to ensure this project crosses the regulatory finish line and begins construction as soon as possible. Now, forgive me, I talked as fast as I could because I know you have questions, and the faster I talk, the more questions from you we get to hear. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. And now I will turn it over to Matthew Hebert, Executive Director of Transportation Policy in my department, who will share more information about regulatory process and timelines. And unlike me, he's an expert. Thank you.
Well,
thank you, Minister.
Yeah, thank you very much, Minister McIver. I really appreciate that. And thank you for your fast talking. So to, in attempt to keep us on schedule, I will let Mr. Hebert speak now.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Minister McIver. Good evening, Minister Schweitzer, and all joining. My name is Matthew Hebert. I'm the Executive Director responsible for advancing the Springbank the Springbank Reservoir project forward through the regulatory process. So on the first slide that you see this evening, slide 2, this just provides some context on where SR1 fits into a broader approach to flood mitigation in the province, of which there are many different tools that are being deployed. In the case of the Elbow River, the Springbank Reservoir, SR1 is the most significant component of that puzzle, but it also includes upstream mitigation in Bragg Creek and Redwood Meadows. It also includes the upgrades to the Glenmore Reservoir that Mayor Nenshi mentioned. On to slide 3. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but there are several components to the SR1 project, which are listed on the right-hand column. The one thing I draw your attention to is Alberta Transportation, at the request of stakeholders, produced a set of updated conceptual images and animations this fall, which are now available on the project website, which is at the government website. So I'd encourage you, if you'd like to see the animation and the images that have been prepared, to just search the project name, it'll take you to our project website, and those animations and images are available to take a look at. The images that we've prepared allow people to see the project from a number of vantage points in the area, both with and without project infrastructure. So it provides very good context about the project and what it looks like on the landscape. On to slide 4. Some of this is refresher, but in terms of how the project operates, SR1 would be activated when the waters in the Elbow River reach 160 meters cubed per second. This is the level at which there's groundwater flooding in the city of Calgary. It allows water to be diverted up to 600 meters cubed per second. And ultimately, there's up to 77.2 million meters cube of storage in the reservoir. So that level of storage combined with the flood storage in the Glenmore project is an equivalent level of water that was received in the 2013 flood. On to slide number 5, and there's been different hints at the regulatory process in the presentations so far. So just to tie it all together, as the minister mentioned, the project requires both federal and provincial approval in order to advance to the construction stage. So in terms of the provincial process, the provincial Ministry of Environment and Parks is in the midst of reviewing our environmental impact assessment, which is the application. That review is at a stage where Environment and Parks has posed a third set of supplemental information requests. Again, supplemental information requests are the opportunity for the regulators to pose questions to proponents to clarify technical details and questions that come from stakeholders. We're in the midst of finalizing responses to those requests. We anticipate the ability to file those as quickly as we can. At which point Environment and Parks will be in a position to do one of two things. As a regulator, they have the ability to continue to ask questions, or they have the ability to deem the application complete. So we are at a pretty critical moment in the review of the application from a provincial standpoint. Simultaneously, the Natural Resources Conservation Board has begun its hearing process. As was referenced, a pre-hearing conference occurred on December the 2nd, of which Transportation, CRCAG, and a number of other parties participated. The board issued a pre-hearing conference report on December the 11th, last Thursday. That report lays out a number of critical aspects, one of them being the start date of the hearing, March 22nd, 2021. It also clarified standing of a number of parties, which includes your organization and among other organizations and individuals. It clarified the issues that the board would hear as part of the process, and also clarified the matter relating to intervenor funding. The board's report is available on their website, so if you are interested in seeing the detail of what the board concluded, it's available for your review. In terms of federal review, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada continues its review. The department filed a second set of supplemental information requests in the summer and a final question in October. We understand the agency continues its review of those responses and the application in general. The agency is at a stage where, again, it would be within their ability to pose additional questions or to reach a stage where they would issue a draft decision statement. So as referenced, we are awaiting word on next steps. For those of you that have been following the process for some time, are aware that the federal regulator has a regulatory clock. So that clock has been running since we filed our last SIR response in October. We're at approximately day 250 of day 365. So that clock continues to run. Assuming positive approvals in both cases, there are a set of additional approvals that are required right ahead of the project progressing to construction. In the case of the province, some approvals required under the Water Act and the Public Lands Act. In the case of the federal process, some approvals required under the Fisheries Act. So those applications are already in development, and we are progressing those with the relevant regulators. In terms of the next slide 6, relating to impacts and mitigation. So through the process, which includes our application and through discussions with stakeholders, Indigenous groups, regulators, relevant support departments, a number of concerns and environmental impacts have been identified. As a proponent, we've continued to refine our understanding of those impacts, but quite critically proposed a number of ways in which those impacts can be mitigated, monitored, and minimized during the construction phase and post-construction, the operational phase. So on to slide 7, I'll go through the detail of the concerns and mitigations in slight detail, but they really break down to 2 ways in our process. The first would be environmental impacts, which includes impacts to air, land, water, wildlife, fish, etc. And then secondly, in terms of the use of the area post-construction. So on to slide number 8. So the next 2 slides cover the 7 areas in which transportation and the government of Alberta have proposed to monitor and mitigate risks to different environmental factors. So first off, wildlife. So we know today that a number of different species use the area or traverse the area. So there are some requirements that relate to fencing and monitoring that have been proposed. Vegetation, which largely relates to how we manage the site, particularly post-flood events and how the area gets recovered. Air quality, both during construction and operations. So in the case of construction, minimizing dust generated by the construction of the dam itself, and in operations, the minimization of silt turning into dust. On to slide 9. Obviously, as a water management project, there's an impact to fish and fish habitat. Our goal is to minimize those impacts. There's certain obligations under the Federal Fisheries Act to offset impacts to fish and fish habitat, and that's one of the supplemental applications that I referenced in the regulatory overview. Again, management related to sediment and dust, and some of the obligations we have to tamp down sediment and to revegetate after construction and after operations. Obligations that relate to the management of surface water quality and contamination in the event of operations. We have certain obligations relating to near continuous testing and monitoring. And then finally, impacts to groundwater wells that exist within the periphery of the reservoir itself, and propose certain obligations related to water well monitoring in the area surrounding the reservoir. On to slide 10, Minister referenced this in terms of the engagement and the extent to which we've engaged. In terms of stakeholders, a number of significant groups listed there. It's not inclusive, nor is it inclusive of the engagement that we've conducted with individuals, either individuals in Calgary, individuals in the Springbank area, and other interested Albertans throughout Southern Alberta. And then on the right-hand side, the engagement program that's been conducted with Indigenous groups, a total of 13, some of which have requirements, consultation requirements as directed by the Aboriginal Consultation Office within the Government of Alberta, and then a larger number that were directed to engage on the part of the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. So that's an engagement program that's continued throughout and continues now and will continue through the duration of the regulatory process, and in some cases would continue through construction and operations should the project be approved. In terms of land use, we've done significant work with Indigenous groups as it relates to the use of the land, and with regulators in terms of commitments that we've made. The important piece around land use is that the obvious primary use is flood mitigation, and then there's a set of secondary uses that are proposed as think most of you know following the project, SR1 involves the conversion of private land to Crown. So the land today is held by private landowners. It is being acquired and assembled by government for the purposes of SR1. And at an operational phase, the land would be Crown land, and such would be available to First Nations in the practice of their treaty rights and other traditional uses. In terms of facilitating that, we've worked to craft principles that would allow Environment and Parks as the eventual operator of SR1 to safely manage the reservoir when needed, but at times when it's not needed to operate as a reservoir would be available for First Nations and their purposes. It would also be available for the public to conduct non-motorized recreation, and then the general management of the reservoir itself, principally grazing. 3,600 acres of grassland would have to be managed. And again, the precise details of that land use plan would be determined by AEP as operator, assuming approval of the project. On to slide 12, and I believe there was a question posed in the Q&A about land acquisition. So at the moment, transportation is pursuing voluntary acquisitions. So these are transportation to landowner discussions. To date, approximately 25% of the project area has been acquired. 3,600 acres is the area of the reservoir itself. And the compensation within voluntary acquisitions is based on the principles of the Expropriation Act, which essentially breaks down to acquiring land based on appraised values, consideration of damages and other costs that may result on account of these negotiations, and the other costs tend to reflect business costs and other disruption, and then any sort of legal costs in obtaining those agreements. On to slide 13, Minister referenced this content. The current value of the project budget in the capital plan is $432 million. Final project costs are based on the 4 factors seen on the slide, which includes the final land acquisition costs. So that's the value to acquire the 3,600 acres. The final design of the project, again, the project continues to progress through engineering, design, and development, of which certain items have been added and refined to the project as it's been developed. As a public project, it will be subject to a competitive tendering process. And then the last 2 items relate to some of the unknown. One would be any conditions that would be a result of the regulatory process. So these would be conditions of approval that would be opposed to the project. And then finally, the length of time the project has taken to advance relative to some of the initial assumptions. So in terms of next steps, the most critical item is the completion of responses to the provincial supplementary information requests. We continue to engage with the public and with Indigenous groups, although that is pivoted slightly as a result of entering into the NRCB's hearing process, taking a bit of a different mode in terms of how we're interacting with groups, but those interactions continue. The NRCB hearing, which has an element of public participation in terms of the parties that have been granted standing. That hearing begins March 22nd. The board has set a hearing of 2 weeks with a potential 3rd week. And assuming regulatory approval from both the province and the federal government, the project would then be in a position to begin construction, which takes a total of 3 construction seasons. The project is partially available for use in a scenario of a 1 in 100 year flood after 2 years of construction, and then is fully operational, meaning the ability to contain a 2013 level flood after 3 years of construction. And on that note, If you have any questions beyond the Q&A this evening, to the next slide, our project email is at the bottom of the screen. And like I said, it's likely easier for you to Google Springbank Offstream Reservoir than to repeat the web address to access any information that's available on the project website. So Brenda, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Hubert. Really appreciate that presentation. It was very informative and hopefully preemptively answered a number of questions that our members may have with respect to how the Springbank project has been advancing. So next up, we're going to be hearing from Ms. Carcy Hines from Alberta Environment and Parks. So Alberta Environment and Parks has accountability for flood mitigation for Alberta. When a specific project like SR1 is decided on to advance, then it may be shifted to another department like transportation, which is the case for SR1, to design and build, but the ultimate accountability for flood mitigation does not shift, and that rests with AEP, or Alberta Environment and Parks. Now, flood mitigation efforts for the Bow River have been advancing more slowly than the Elbow, and the project work is in a much earlier stage. I think fully mitigating flood water on the Bow is complicated. It will likely take multiple solutions working together rather than a single large project. So we're going to hear some more this evening from Ms. Hines about progress for flood mitigation on the Bow and what we can expect to see going forward in 2021. So I'd like to turn it over now to Ms. Hines.
Great, thanks for that, Brenda. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Terrific. So yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity to provide you with an update on the important work that we've been undertaking on the Bow River Reservoir Options Project, as we call it, which, as you mentioned, Brenda, is looking at new flood and drought protection on the Bow River to protect Calgary and downstream communities. And at the end, too, I'd also like to provide a bit of an update on the provincial flood mapping studies that we've recently released for public feedback, which include flood inundation maps. So let me get the next slide, please. So we'll begin with the Bow River Reservoir project, and the next couple slides that I'm going to go through with you are a quick refresher for those of you who may not be familiar with how we got to be where we are today. So this is the overall timeline of the project, and on the left-hand side you'll see we've got the 2013 flood marked, which I know you're all too familiar with. So shortly after the 2013 flood, in about 2015, there was a group called the Bow River Working Group, which was a multi-stakeholder group of water managers and users that included municipalities and First Nations along the Bow River, watershed public advisory councils, industry, irrigation districts, and non-government organizations. And that group was asked by the province to provide some recommendations to us on how to reduce flood and drought within the Bow River Basin. So that group began their work in 2016, and it resulted in a report that was accepted by government in 2017 that contained a number of different recommendations, and one of which was to complete conceptual assessments of 3 major infrastructure options on the Bow River. So if you look at the light green color there, so that was basically kicking off the Bow River Reservoir Options Project. So that started in 2018, and it consists of 4 different phases that unfortunately are anticipated to take at least 14 years to complete from when the project was originally initiated in 2018. And you can see by the red star there, we're right at the beginning of phase 2, the feasibility study. And there are phases 3 and 4 that would come after that. So if we can get the next slide, please. So this slide illustrates how we began with 15 different potential flood and drought mitigation schemes being identified and assessed by the Bow River Working Group. And out of that work came the recommendation to complete the conceptual assessment of the 3 different water management infrastructure options, which is in the light green there. So phase 1 conceptual assessment, that work has recently been completed, and the final report is available online and is out in the public realm. And where we are today is in that green box, where we're now taking those same 3 options through the next phase, which is through a feasibility study, which we're just getting underway. And that phase is going to determine the feasibility of the 3 potential reservoir options. And that will inform a government decision on whether to proceed to phase 3 with one of the options. For reference, the SR1 project is in phase 3. If we get the next slide, please. So many of you may be familiar with this map if you've participated in our engagement or if you attended last year's AGM. So this is an overall part of the reach that was studied during the conceptual assessment phase, and it shows the 3 different options that were examined during that phase. So for reference, you can see Calgary's a little purple box down on the right. And if we go all the way upstream to the Morley option there on the left, that's the first option, and it's located within the Stoney Nakoda First Nation land and would involve a new dam less than 1 kilometer upstream of the community of Morley. In the middle is the relocated Ghost Dam option. That would replace the existing Ghost Dam with a new dam, approximately 3 kilometers downstream from the existing dam. And then over to your right is the Glenblow East option, and that would involve a new dam, and it's about 4 kilometers upstream of the existing Bearspaw Dam near Calgary. So for each of these options, during the conceptual assessment phase, we completed conceptual designs, an initial desktop study of impacts of the different reservoirs, and a high-level cost estimate of each one of them. I should also note that all the reservoir designs included both flood and drought mitigation capacity and hydroelectric power generation ability. Next slide, please. So around the time of last year's AGM, that we were wrapping up the technical work on the conceptual assessment. It was mostly complete, and the broader public engagement was just being kicked off. So the Bow River Working Group, which I mentioned earlier, was engaged throughout the conceptual assessment to receive progress updates on the Bow Options project and the other recommendations in their 2017 report. CRCAG and the City of Calgary have also been engaged throughout the conceptual assessment, including, we do monthly phone calls to provide updates on flood mitigation initiatives in the Calgary area. Engagement with potentially affected stakeholders, Indigenous communities, and the public was formally initiated in the fall of 2019, including the 3 public information sessions in Calgary and Cochrane that occurred soon after the AGM last year. So the feedback that we collected through all the various engagement sessions was included in the conceptual assessment final report, and that was publicly released in August of this year, and you can find that on our Open Alberta website. Next slide, please. So we're currently in the process right now of getting a contract in place with a consultant to carry out the next phase of the study, which is the feasibility study. So that study is going to build on the work completed during the conceptual assessment. And whereas the conceptual assessment was more of a desktop exercise, the feasibility study is actually going to get us out on the land and start evaluating the feasibility of the 3 options in much more detail in order to recommend a single preferred option. So it's going to include environmental field work, geotechnical investigation to assess the soil and bedrock conditions, and of course continued engagement with Indigenous communities, potentially affected stakeholders, and the public, including CRCAG, to fully understand the potential impacts of any and all of the options. So the information that we're going to gather during the feasibility stage is going to inform the final design, the risk assessment, and cost analysis for each of the options. And I should note that at the same time as we're doing the feasibility study, we're also going to be doing parallel work to explore alternatives to a dam. This is required under the Impact Assessment Act of Canada for the regulatory approvals phase of the project. So we're getting that underway now. Next slide, please. Okay, and I just want to also wrap up here by providing you a bit of an update on the provincial flood mapping studies that are now available for public comment. So our team has been doing a ton of work over the last few years, and they've recently completed 21 new flood studies covering over 1,500 kilometers of river across the province, including in the Calgary area. So these studies include over 600 kilometers of updated mapping and over 900 kilometers of mapping in areas that have never been mapped before. All of our new studies include maps for 13 different sized open water floods. So that's anywhere from a 1 and 2 year flood all the way up to an extreme 1 in 1,000 year flood, and 3 ice jam floods for communities that are at risk of that kind of flooding. So this represents the largest undertaking of flood mapping in our province's history. Next slide, please. So the main study that I assume Calgarians are probably interested in is our new Bow and Elbow River flood study. So the new study covers 72 kilometers of the Bow River, 66 kilometers of the Elbow, as well as 1 kilometer of Bread Creek and 7 kilometers of Lot Creek. Public engagement on these studies began on Monday, November 30th. The draft flood inundation maps and technical reports can all be found online, and the opportunity is open to provide feedback until January 15th. Your feedback is going to help ensure that these projects are technically sound, but you don't need to be an engineer or a flood expert to provide us with feedback. We're going to carefully consider any and all feedback that's provided, and we will revise the draft reports and flood maps to address technical concerns as appropriate. I should clarify that the focus of this engagement is on the draft flood inundation maps that are used to support emergency preparedness and response. So these are the maps that show during the different size floods where the water is going to go. These are not, the engagement does not cover the flood hazard maps. Those are the maps that delineate, what's in a floodway versus what's in a flood fringe. We expect to, once the inundation map engagement is finished and we incorporate the feedback, then we'll produce the draft flood hazard maps and engage with local authorities on those in 2021, next year, and with public engagement to follow once we've incorporated feedback from local authorities. Next slide, please. So finally, just a couple extra notes on the Bow and Elbow River flood study. So the flood study does include information from the 2013 flood, but as Calgary continues to work hard to improve flood resilience within the city, not all of the new flood berms that have been built recently are included yet. For example, we have worked with the city to include the zoo barrier in the draft maps that are currently out for engagement, but they do not include the other new flood berms just yet, including the West Eau Claire flood barrier or other berms that are currently under construction. So we'll continue to work closely with the city to update our maps and include the new flood berms as soon as possible. And when new dams or reservoirs dedicated to flood mitigation are built in the future, we'll consider flood map revisions to incorporate their effects as appropriate. That would include SR1 once that's constructed and any potential reservoir built or expanded on the Bow River. I think that's our final slide. So thanks so much for this opportunity to provide this update to your members. I know that this work, both on the reservoir and the flood maps, are really important to your members. It's very important to us too, and we'll continue to keep you updated both through our regular meetings with CRCAG and also through our engagement activities on both projects. So thanks very much.
All right, well, thank you very much, Ms. Hines. And I failed to indicate Ms. Hines' title. So she is Executive Director of Environmental Knowledge and Prediction Branch at Alberta Environment and Parks. So thank you very much for joining us. And I appreciate that you pointed out where we were last fall during the time frame of our last AGM as compared to where we are now. It was, although slow, I think it's really encouraging to see that there has been progress and advancement of the work to get flood mitigation on the Bow.
You bet. Thanks.
Great. The downtown Calgary is critical. I mean, it's the economic engine of our city, of our province, and arguably of Western Canada. And to protect downtown Calgary, we actually need flood mitigation on both rivers. They both contribute to flooding in downtown Calgary. So SR1 on the Elbow is critical to protect the downtown core, as is the work that Ms. Hines just described on the Bow River. And it's also important to have mitigation projects within the city limits to the extent that they can help reduce property damage. So tonight we're going to be hearing from Mr. Frank Frigo from the City of Calgary, Calgary's Water Resources Business Unit. Mr. Frigo is a water resources engineer specializing in hydrology. He leads the hydraulic modeling, flood protection, river flood preparedness, planning and response, watershed management, bank restoration, drainage, and water supply initiatives for the City of Calgary. and he's an expert in this area. He's spoken at our AGM many times previously. He's a passionate supporter of water management for the city of Calgary, which includes mitigating against flooding. So it's with my pleasure to now turn the floor over to Mr. Frago.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having the City of Calgary participate in tonight's AGM. Next slide, please. Very quickly, I just want to remind everyone of the City of Calgary's overall flood resilience plan that was adopted back by Council in 2017. Provide some reference points around what we were focusing on in 2020 and indicate what we are going to be focusing on in 2021. Next slide, please. Yeah, so after about 4 years of intensive study and intensive public engagement, in 2017, Council did adopt a flood mitigation measures assessment that administration brought to Council. It fundamentally looked at having a backbone of structural mitigation for flood, structural resilience for flood, which involved a couple of key components on the Elbow River and 3 key components on the Bow River. On the Elbow River, Springbank Reservoir, working in tandem with the Glenmore Gates, would provide a level of resilience to be able to manage a 2013 or larger sized flood. On the Bow River, 3 main pieces of mitigation, structural mitigation working together, which include the upstream additional storage provided by a new Bow River reservoir option, the continuation of the 2016 Trans-Alta Agreement for the management of the Ghost Reservoir, and reservoirs on the Kananaskis River, as well as local barriers, drainage improvements, and other local works that could be undertaken within the confines of the City of Calgary. Those were the 3 major structural components for the Bow River. All of these pieces were intended to work together with some of the non-structural components, including land use regulation and policy, building regulations, education awareness and other lot level programs, and of course emergency preparedness, emergency response refinement, and forecasting improvements. These layered components of resilience were intended to work together in the city's overall plan to provide a high level of combined resilience. And when I say high, I mean in general for all communities, we're aiming something above the 100-year standard upon which the flood hazard mapping that Ms. Hines had talked about is based. Next slide, please. In 2020, we did pass some significant projects into operation, the first of which has been mentioned a couple of times tonight. It is the Glenmore Gates project. This $80 million project, which was funded in part through the Alberta Community Resilience Program, sees the rough doubling of the live storage capacity in the Glenmore Reservoir, which increases the threshold of damage to about 1.5 times what the 2005 flood was. So while Glenmore, even with the gates, still provides a smaller volume of total flood storage capacity, certainly than the Springbank Reservoir project would, it does increase our resilience very significantly as that important investment upstream is being configured. We also completed work on other local barriers, including one at the Heritage Drive Deerfoot Meadows intersection. This is really important to protecting Deerfoot, which becomes a very important access route for access and egress during flood events. We completed work on the Mission Island hydraulic improvements, which also helped us enhance fish habitat while increasing the flow capacity around that important structure on the Elbow River. We completed work in Montgomery around a flood and erosion project that had been configured for that community. And very importantly, through 2020, we did complete, as we do annually, refinements to our flood emergency response plan. 2020 was a very interesting year because in addition to the changes to our plan and the reassignment of priorities with the Glenmore Gates now being in play, we were able to plan for and adapt to the restrictions around COVID-19 to be able to ensure the City of Calgary would have been able to respond to a significant event had one occurred, despite the ongoing accommodations around COVID. Finally, we worked with Alberta Environment and the University of Waterloo to develop a new flow forecasting platform to help us provide better foresight as to the developing conditions in the catchment upstream so that we can better forecast and prepare for floods. Next slide, please. And I mentioned 2020 was an important year with the addition of Glenmore Gates and the bringing into service of other key mitigation pieces of work that were completed in 2020. We passed the milestone of having averted over half of the total damage profile that we understand was facing the city of Calgary in 2013 prior to any mitigation work being done. Significant advancement, and we continue to move the needle. If you recall, last year at the AGM, I believe we were around 40%. We're now up around 54%. But that does mean that there is still significant remaining risk on both the Bow and the Elbow Rivers, and that risk accrues to very significant amounts over the kinds of design life of the major infrastructure that would be put in place to try to mitigate it. When I describe this 50% reduction, it really does attach or pertain more to the damages that would occur to the smaller or more modest flood events in the grand population of flood events. So your 1 in 10, your 1 in 5, your 1 in 20 year events, which we would expect to see multiple times in a century. Not so much have all the investments been able to cut down that damage profile for the very large events. For those very large events, they simply do occur at a scale at which works within the city of Calgary cannot mitigate alone. And that's why the important work on upstream mitigation does need to continue and is very key and central to the city of Calgary's overall flood resilience plan. And that remaining damage, as significant as the advances have been with infrastructure and operations put in place since 2013, that damage accrues to over $7 billion over a 100-year lifespan. Again, the kind of lifespan that would be attached to significant investments for upstream storage, for instance. Next slide, please. For 2021, some of the focal points that the City of Calgary will be putting investment and energy into, continuing on with the design and implementation of the Sunnyside flood barrier, completing the work on the 9th Avenue Southeast Bridge, which will increase the hydraulic capacity of that structure, working on the Sunnyside Upper Plateau drainage improvement project. Importantly, recently materials have been procured and construction is expected to start in the spring of 2021. Continuing to work with the community of Bowness around the potential for a barrier or other options in that community. Working on the Center Street gravel bar to increase the capacity around that important crossing of the Bow River. Very importantly, continuing the work that was started with the West Eau Claire barrier downtown, continuing from Eau Claire Plaza all the way to Edmonton Trail. That's a very important project that will see the protection of our downtown. Some work around Crowchow Trail, where we need to do some work to address gravel bar placement that had occurred in 2013, could impact communities of West Hillhurst and Parkdale, and work planned again, much more minor in scope, but on the Scullin Bridge, the 25th Avenue Bridge crossing the Elbow River. So these are by all means not all of the projects that we're going to be working on, but several of the important or keynote ones that will be focal in 2021. Next slide, please. In terms of regional flood mitigation, the City of Calgary continues to play a role in the Springbank Offstream Reservoir. The City of Calgary has been part of the IAC Technical Advisory Group. We are participating as an intervener in the NRCB hearing that you've heard quite a bit about tonight, and we do continue to assess the operations of Glenmore Reservoir to work synergistically with the Springbank Offstream Reservoir. On the Bow River Reservoir options, we have been very pleased to continue to engage with the Government of Alberta, supporting that enterprise, that work with data, technical review, and input as we can afford to provide it, to be able to help the province configure that phase 2 work that Ms. Hines talked about, to bring the evaluation of alternatives to a single reservoir option and site. And finally, we continue to support the Government of Alberta and TransAlta with information on flood response requirements to assist with the renewal of the Ghost and Kananaskis Reservoir Agreement renewal for ahead of the runoff season in 2021. Next slide, please. Finally, just a few notes around flood mapping and land use regulation. Ms. Hines gave a very clear description of the work that the province has been doing around developing new mapping. As a City of Calgary, we do encourage citizens to take advantage of the opportunity that the province is providing for feedback on the inundation maps. We do understand that the inundation maps will provide the technical basis to develop hazard maps later on through 2021. We've had an excellent working relationship with the flood hazard team at Alberta Environment, continue to work closely with them to be able to understand how new mapping is going to be rolled out. Very importantly, as Ms. Hines mentioned, the work that was completed could not capture all of the mitigation work that's been ongoing in the City of Calgary. A body of work internally at the City of Calgary is being put together to make sure we can provide information as timely as possible to the Government of Alberta so that its maps can be amended to address mitigation plans and mitigation measures that have been put in place or are in process of being put in place now. Importantly, a large body of work is being conducted by the City of Calgary on our water resources, planning, parks, roads. Other groups internally are actively involved in work addressing flood hazard area zones and policy review so that as the government's new flood hazard maps are developed and then consulted on, that the City of Calgary will be prepared to engage to be able to update appropriately the land use bylaw and other policy documents that guide the land use and development decisions that the Development Authority undertakes. And finally, we do recognize that flood hazard area maps, that the Government of Alberta is working on through 2021 will be engaging with the GOA on those maps and the appropriate interpretation of the policy intent behind them in the context of the City of Calgary, especially with regard to mitigation that's either in place or underway. The next slide. And certainly it'd be remiss to not take a moment to acknowledge the excellent work that the Government of Alberta has been doing. Several groups within Alberta Environment and Parks have been very, very key to allowing the City of Calgary to continue on its path of flood resilience. We work very closely with the River Forecast Group, the Resilience and Mitigation Group, the Bow Operations Group, the Flood Hazard Mapping Group, and very importantly with Alberta Transportation's Water Control Structures Design and Delivery Group. Thank you to the Government of Alberta. It has been a positive partnership that we have been working through to achieve some of the increases in resilience that I talked about through 2020 and over the last 7 years since 2013. And finally, a strong thank you to CRCAG and Flood Free YYC. I'm continually impressed with the degree of organization, thoughtfulness, and the energy that your group is applying. Whether you agree with all of the City of Calgary stances or not, I absolutely applaud you for remaining involved and staying energetic, having your voices heard by not only the organization that I'm employed by, the City of Calgary, but also by the Government of Alberta and all other stakeholders involved in the water management for Southern Alberta. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you very much, Mr. Frigo. We really appreciate it. That was an informative presentation as always, and thank you again for taking time out of your evening to join us here. So that does end our panelists' presentations, and we have some time left here for some questions and answers. We've had a few come in over the Q&A function. I also want to call out and acknowledge that we have several additional subject matter experts joining us this evening that are available to assist our panelists in answering questions if required. They're here because they are working on flood and mitigation projects for either the Elbow or the Bow River. I think it's important to acknowledge their presence here tonight because we're well outside business hours, and we're just grateful that they would take the time out of their evening to join us. And for many of these folks, I know this isn't the first evening that they have spent consulting with public on flood mitigation or mapping, and we really appreciate their dedication. So the additional folks that we have joining us include Tara Cook, who's Director of Coordination for the Springbank Offstream Reservoir Project with Transportation. Matt Wood, a hydrotechnical and civil engineer from Stantec Consulting. Dave Brescia, a senior regulatory and environmental advisor from Stantec Consulting. And Wayne Speller, an environmental engineer and principal at Golder Associates. From Alberta Environment and Parks, we are joined by Andrew Wilson, Director of Watershed Resilience and Transboundary Water. Bryce Hemela, Flood Hazard Manager. Denise Oriat, Senior Manager, Community Resilience. Michaela Gerling, Grant Coordinator. Peter Onishko, Flood Hazard Specialist. And we're also joined by Ken Kress from AMAC. So thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't miss anyone. So we did have some questions come in over our Q&A, and I'm going to start by asking Ms. Hines if she would answer a couple of questions that we have around flood mapping. So one question is, and I'll just read it verbatim here. It says, will the upstream bow mitigation project be selected and designed to meet the requirements for a favorable flood hazard map revision, as opposed to building the infrastructure and then later evaluating the impacts on flood hazard? Incorporating mapping needs into the project design might speed up the ultimate flood hazard map updates. So Ms. Hines, if you're able to comment on that, or if you wanted to turn that over to someone else, please do.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda, and thanks for the question, Charlie. So I'll maybe start, and then I'll hand it to some of the people who actually know what they're talking about on the line, if you don't mind. So, yeah, what I would say, Charlie, is that you know, we need to really understand what is actually happening with the Bow Reservoir. You know, as you know, we've got 3 different options. There's still a ton of work that needs to happen in order for us to understand what their impact might actually be on flood hazard maps. So yes, it will be incorporated, but there's so much more work that has to happen through the Bow Reservoir design before we could consider doing something like that. But I can say that members of the flood hazard mapping team are closely involved in the Bow Reservoir project. So they are both, I should mention, I have the river forecast team, the community flood resilience team, the flood hazard mapping team. They are all within my branch, as well as the team working on the Bow Reservoir Options project. And that's on purpose, right? We're bringing all those people together to make sure that we're integrated in how we're moving forward. So maybe I'll leave it there, and maybe I'll just offer it to Peter Onishko if there's anything else he'd like to say about that as the expert in the mapping.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carcy. I don't think I have really, you know, too much to add, other than when we're talking about the potential design and operational parameters for dams and reservoirs. We absolutely shared all of our base data and draft information about hydrology, survey information, you know, with the design team for both SR1 and transportation, as well as internally for options looking at Bow River Reservoir options. So we did share all that information, and we're happy to continue sharing it. But at I guess the end of the day, you know, the design and operational parameters and the goals of either reservoir, you know, really aren't set by us. They're set by the needs and the design, and whatever those kind of parameters and final designs are, we will work with the operators, the owners, the designers, and be able to understand the impact to peak flood flows for a variety of different flood scenarios. And then that kind of information, you know, that's what we'll be using to kind of assess and consider how mapping can or needs to be adjusted appropriately once those structures are in place. Yeah, and absolutely, we're working hard on looking at different ways to reflect potential flow mitigation into maps if it's appropriate. We're working definitely with the City of Calgary, our colleagues at Transportation and other departments. And once we have any movement on that and any options, just like the flood inundation maps have gone through municipal and First Nation review and also are now under public engagement, any kind of changes, any new flood hazard maps will follow the same kind of municipal review and public engagement process. So I hope that's kind of answers a little bit of what you were getting at. And, you know, I'm sure Bryce and Carsey can probably provide a kind of higher level information as well if I didn't cover anything.
All right, thanks very much, Mr. Oneshko and Ms. Hines. And there's another question that came in. It's along the same vein, and you kind of touched on it, Mr. Oneshko, but it has to do with, and Tony mentioned it earlier in his comments, you know, the timing of flood mapping. So the flood hazard maps for Calgary haven't been updated since the late 1980s. And I think some of us are questioning, why do them now when we're on the brink of having some potential mitigation put in place on the elbow? So the question was that, you know, the issue of flood mapping continues to be a contentious issue. How can flood maps be modified prior to mitigation? And if so, are they going to be modified after Springbank is completed or after Bow River mitigation is completed? I think I did hear Mr. Oneshko kind of touch on that and talk about that they might be modified, you know, if appropriate. This is actually a really burning issue for our members. I think we're really concerned about what these maps might do to property values. And I guess, you know, curious about the timing and how, you know, if they're only modified, you know, every 30 or 40 years, you know, are they going to be modified again in close proximity to mitigation being put in place? So I'll let, you know, Mr. Oneshko or Ms. Hines speak to that, please.
Sure. Carsey, do you want me to take that, or would you like to kind of comment?
Sure, you go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, so absolutely, you know, when I said as appropriate, that was just to make sure we get it right. That was the context of that. With regards to timing, you know, I can say we're working on options and assessing things already, and that, you know, we're working really hard, and hopefully we'll be able to share some new information with the City of Calgary, you know, next year as early as we can, and have that public consultation soon thereafter. Our intention is not years from now, and I think, you know, I think we have a lot more understanding of how Albertans and Calgarians want maps updated to reflect, you know, new mitigation as it comes online. So I can't foresee any map today not being updated for 30 more years if next year or 3 years from now major infrastructure is in place. So you know, we are working with the city and looking at options right now on how to update, you know, within months, not years, the new berms that are in place. And I can only say that we will work as hard and fast as we can to look at how other larger scale reservoirs and dams might play into updates.
Thanks, Peter. And can I maybe add, it's Carsey here, on the timing of sharing those inundation maps. So it's really important for emergency response planning purposes that, you know, Calgary and citizens understand what the risk is, right? So they understand where the water might go under different scenarios. And, you know, it's really important for us to share that information with our River Forecast Center in the province and with the City of Calgary's Forecast Center. So there's a real public safety issue here. So that is sort of the urgency around sharing those inundation maps. And the hazard maps, I know there are other land use implications for that cause people concern, absolutely. But like Peter said, those are coming down the road. But really that, I just want to explain the timing on the inundation maps and the urgency to get them out there in the public so that people know where the water is going to go. That is the urgency around that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ms. Hines and Mr. Oneshko. I think those answers were helpful. And Frank, I think there was something that you wanted to comment on from the City of Calgary perspective with respect to flood mapping. So maybe I'll just give you that opportunity now.
Thanks, Brenda. Yes, I was just going to add that on the second last, I think, of my slides, I indicated some work is ongoing within the city to look at the process for updating maps and to address, new approaches to flood hazard policy. One of the things we're considering is how to make it so that we can very rapidly, as mitigation is being put in place, make appropriate amendments to the land use bylaw. Right now, to change the land use bylaw, of course, we would have to go to council. That involves a number of steps. That typically involves going to committees of council firsthand. And so part of the work that the city is undertaking now is looking at, as mitigation is being put in place, how can we work within our own process to make those changes effective and quick. On top of that, I would add that the city of Calgary is considering how we will deal with the interim mitigation, or pardon me, the interim regulation process. So as the province is releasing new information, of course, it's our intent to share that with the public, with all applicants, so that they have all of the information that's available, not just what's in our land use bylaw, but also what the province has produced. And then that will also help inform decisions where discretion is possible within the land use bylaw. So we want to assure people that the official speed limit is not going to change until the bylaw actually changes, but our intent is to work with land use applicants to make sure they have all the information available, so that when they're making important decisions about investing and redeveloping property, that they have good information to be able to do that with, and an understanding of where the city of Calgary is going with that.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Frigo, for adding that. That was helpful. We're getting short on time. I do have another question, though, that I would like to put to Mr. Hebert, and it has to do with the regulatory process. So there's a question of, how does an NRCB decision impact an IAAC decision? So that would be the Federal Impact Assessment Agency. So how are those connected, and how would the NRCB decision have any impact on the federal process?
So the straightforward answer is no. They're two completely independent processes. So the NRCB process, which is now trending towards a hearing, will ultimately lead in a public interest decision by the NRCB. And separately, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, on the part of the agency, will reach or make a recommendation to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. So they're two distinct and independent processes. They don't intertwine, they don't collide. One isn't dependent on the other. So we await conclusions of both processes before we're able to move on to the next step.
Okay, thank you very much for providing that answer. Really appreciate it. So at this point, I think we've answered most of the questions, and we are out of time. So before we close our meeting, there are a number of people that I would actually like to thank, including everyone that has attended this evening, which we'll get to in a minute. But a big thank you to our elected officials, Mayor Nenshi, Minister McIver, and Minister Schweitzer, for joining us tonight, and for their unwavering support of flood mitigation for the city of Calgary, and all of the efforts that they have personally made to keep this issue at the forefront of government priorities. Our biggest risk is that people forget, and that the political will wanes on this issue. And so these folks have been instrumental in keeping flood mitigation for the city of Calgary as a high priority. And that's critical to us actually seeing this through and ensuring that the city is protected. So I'd like to thank them very much for their efforts and for coming this evening. I would like to thank again all of this evening's panelists, including Mr. Hebert, Ms. Hines, and Mr. Frigo. We appreciate you taking the time out of your evening. It's a busy time of year, although maybe this year not as busy as normal, but we are well outside business hours, and we're really thankful to your dedication to this important work, and that you've taken the time to join us tonight and to prepare your comments. I'd like to thank everyone from the Calgary River Communities Action Group that's provided us letters detailing their experiences during the 2013 flood. We've heard a number of times this evening about how important these letters are. And what we've seen come through to date have been very impactful. And this is absolutely necessary. This is the evidence that we will be providing on your behalf at the NRCB hearing. You heard Simon talk about how we will be providing a witness panel at the hearing, likely to be Tony, myself, and Paul Battistella from Flood Free Calgary. But we're there to speak to the public interest and why Springbank is absolutely in the public interest. But we're only 3 people. And we can say that we represent 1,000 property owners, but it's actually a lot more impactful if we can demonstrate that we represent all of you. And we can demonstrate that by providing your letters as part of our evidence package, by using quotes directly from your letters when we present evidence. It's much more meaningful. We could provide you a form letter to sign off on, but that's not going to have the same impact with the panelists. They really want to hear from you. What was your experience? And, it should only take a short amount of your time to pen us that letter, and you can send it by email, but it's really important, and it will have a big impact at the hearing. So thanks very much to everyone who submitted a letter, and please keep them coming and urge your neighbors to do the same thing. This is a call to action and it really matters. It's a pivotal moment in getting flood protection on the elbow. I'd also like to take some time, of course, to thank all the volunteers that make up the Calgary River Communities Action Group. I've been working with this group for more than 7 years now. The dedication and passion is unrivaled. Our regulatory committee is really stepping into high gear right now as we get ready for the NRCB hearing, which is going to come up pretty quickly in 2021. Erin Fahey, our Director of Communications, is the brains behind the many emails and social media messages you see from us. She's played a significant role in organizing tonight's AGM. I would also like to thank David Carlson from our board, who helped us get the technical logistics organized for tonight, which I can now confidently say worked out rather well. I don't think we had any technical glitches, so thank you very much, David, for helping us pull off this virtual AGM. And we certainly need to give a big call out to my co-president and seemingly tireless leader, Tony Morris. Tony, he's a partner at a law firm. He works full-time and long hours as a lawyer, yet somehow he still finds time to keep current on every issue relating to flood mitigation and mapping. He's digested just a tremendous volume of information, which he can recall without hesitation. It's really quite incredible. He's done a tremendous job in keeping this group motivated, engaged, and driven toward our ultimate goal, which is flood protection for Calgary. So thank you very much, Tony. And thanks everyone who's attended our meeting tonight. We actually had a really good turnout, and the majority of you have hung in through the duration of the meeting. So thank you so much for continuing to be engaged. And for those of you who drop us the occasional note of encouragement and thanks, we read those and it means a lot to us. So we're at a close for this evening and for our 2020 AGM. I would like to wish all of you a very happy holidays, a Merry Christmas, and all the best in 2021. And hopefully our next AGM, we will be able to return to an in-person format. And with all the cards aligned, hopefully we will get mitigation at some point, and we won't have these AGMs every year. It's incredible to think how far out we are from the 2013 flood, and we're still coming together. But the fact that we are, I think, really goes to show how important this issue is for Calgarians. So thanks very much.
And I'd like to thank you, Brenda, for what you bring to the table. It's just so motivational, and you've been just such a beacon of intelligence and stick-with-itness. You have really motivated the group, and this is a tremendous collection of people. We're very, very lucky to have the folks who we do, and the members behind us all the way. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. Good night.
All the best. Have a great Christmas break.